Good afternoon. This is Nauta speaking, also on behalf of Professor Taekyun Kim of Seoul National University. Today, we are going to look at degrowth and non-Western discourses, particularly Ubuntu, South Africa, and Dure, South Korea. What is the problem? The problem is that the world is heading towards disaster in terms of climate change. One of the main issues here is that we are captured, we are trapped in an ideology of economic growth. There is, if we take a usual rate of global growth of 3% a year, it means that every 23 years, the world economy doubles in size. That means it doubles in terms of energy use, resource use, CO2 production, pollution, etc. And what we also don't always remember is that economic growth generally seems to benefit the top 1%. In terms of the issues, capitalism is a driving force, obviously, of economic growth. And according to German scientist Lessenich, we live in what he calls externalization societies. It means that the wealthy citizens of the world are better off because others are worse off. We have externalized nearly everything: energy use, pollution, environmental degradation, the destruction of nature, exploitation of labor, and also human rights violations. Another important thing to consider is that capitalism is closely related to what Hickel calls enclosures. Already in Britain, from the 17th century onwards, people were basically kicked off the land. They were denied access to commons, land, forest, game, water, fish. And this was strengthened by the Reformation, as Catholic monasteries were closed all over Europe. And it meant that the poor basically poured into the cities that then became the big labor reserve for the Industrial Revolution. The other aspect, namely colonialism, is important to consider. Enclosure was on the one hand internal colonization, as we just mentioned, but there was also the process of colonization. And, you know, the slave trade, for example, can be seen as a form of enclosure of bodies, of labor. Now, degrowth can be something to consider as a solution. But first of all, we must recognize that the SDGs embody this capitalist logic. Namely, there is this frame that inclusive, sustainable economic growth is possible, that we can combine everything. But according to several authors, green growth is actually a fantasy. One of the things that Hickel shows in a very interesting example is that the amount of clean energy that has been produced since 2000, namely 8 billion more megawatt hours, hasn't even been enough to deal with the energy demand increases due to global economic growth, which was 48 billion megawatt hours. Degrowth can be an alternative because it is planned, it's coherent policy to reduce ecological impact, to reduce inequality. And it's a discriminating approach in terms of reducing economic activity. For example, if we stop producing SUVs, if we stop producing beef, sorry, and if we introduce policies to prevent unemployment, also to seek reduce inequality and share national and global income more fairly, and also to expand universal public goods and services, as well as rapidly transition to renewable energy, restore soils, biodiversity, etc. Things can look much better in several decades. What are some of the issues regarding degrowth? First of all, we need to convince also ordinary people that degrowth is not recession, that longer-term issues, namely climate change, can be addressed now and fairly, and that not growth, but fair redistribution is actually the solution. We also need to consider that it requires structural change, and therefore the powers that be will not concede without a fight. How will we deal with corporate interests? And who is going to take the lead in terms of democracies that are, for example, already struggling? We might take inspiration from Ubuntu, a communal understanding of personhood in sub-Saharan Africa. The Amaxhosa saying, Umtu Gumtu Gabanya Bantu, embodies this. A person is a person through other people. This comes back in several other Southern African languages like Sotho and Shona, who each have their version of this. Important in Ubuntu is that there is a concept of wholeness, and life extends to the environment, but also to future generations. And as Ramos shows, there is a triad comprised of the living, the ancestors, and the yet to be born. And this obviously gels well with, for example, the Brundtland report that already talked about the need for future generations to secure the possibility for future generations to meet their own needs. It is about striving for harmony between the living, the ancestors, and then to be able to secure the yet to be born. And therefore, according to Ramos, we have to listen to the ancestors and be, as he says, attentive to their whisper. If we look more deeply into Ubuntu, we can also see that there is quite frequently an anti-capitalist understanding of wealth, for example, illustrated by the Sesotho proverb, Feta Kromo Ochware Moto, which means go past the cow and catch the human being. In other words, if you have the choice between giving a cow to a suffering human being so that he or she can feed himself, herself, or slaughter the cow in order to feed a suffering human being, then that is what you need to do. So helping someone is always the most important thing. Also, there is a philosophy of moderation in terms of accumulation in Ubuntu that can also help us in degrowth. It teaches us about being more humane, being more gentle, being more hospitable, and being more generous. It's interesting if we look at the position of cattle, the relationship of people and livestock, that cattle are part of the social fabric. Livestock is culturally constituted as a type of property which is not easily sold. And therefore, livestock herds link families. And it also means that if we look at lobola, the practice of paying bride wealth from a Western point of view. It's certainly not about buying a wife. It's not a transaction as such. It's about families getting connected through herds. It's also in Sub-Saharan Africa, the relationship with animals is much more related to what it means to be a human being. These are some stills from a art project by Buhlebezwe Siwani, who studies but also performs art to look at Xhosa culture, colonialism, and particularly the relationship with spirits and the environment. Interesting stuff. We have to be critical as well, because according to Mangena, scholars like Eze show us that there's a chance that we romanticize the past too much in terms of thinking about Ubuntu. We have to understand that so-called traditions in Sub-Saharan Africa have been strongly impacted and being perverted by colonialism. And that in Ubuntu scholarship, also placing it opposite Western, hard Western rationality, profit-seeking rationality, that the West is often described as a caricature, very one-dimensionally. And, you know, what about violence, exploitation, capitalist expansion, and profit-seeking by African actors in Africa? How do we understand that? And let's not forget that Ubuntu already has been co-opted by capitalism. Look at this Ubuntu management group, for example. Moving to South Korea, we can look at Dure, egalitarian cooperatives. There are two forms of that might be interesting to us. Hyang Yak, which is much more top-down. This was designed and already inspired by Confucian thinking in Chosun culture, but designed by powerful elites, particularly to use as a political institutional instrument to control and mobilize labor by the lower classes. Dure, however, has much more of a bottom-up feel to it. And it's these are forms of collective farming, where all males in the village work on each other's farm to help each other during labor peaks. So these are much more kind of autonomous organizational forms and based on an egalitarian ethos. What is complicated in the South Korean context is that during the dictatorship of Chung-hee Park in the 60s and 70s, Dure has been used as a mobilizing force behind Saemaul-undong, the new village movement. So there the government also played quite a top-down role. What can Dure teach us? It can provide empirical contributions to the concept of degrowth. It includes, for example, rural cooperatives for slow food, for fair trade, for social economies, for community-based tourism. And that's what you now also see in Korea, for example, Dure for Tour, which means community-based tourism initiatives, and Dure for welfare services. So that it's about the provision of social security systems which can replace or be in addition to the public policies of local governments. And here you see some representations of what Dure might have looked like in the past, men work in the field together, and much more in the present with, in the right-hand corner, the tourist, community-based tourism with these traditional pots. Also here we have to be critical, and we have to recognize that in the legacy of Dure, there are these cultural rules that are not simply residues from a traditional past, but have been reshaped by contemporary social processes. That there are positive tendencies of modern Dure, namely that, it brings the concept of mutual accountability for local communities back, and, for example, marries them with market-based mechanisms. But there's negative tendencies as well to consider, namely that the solidarity-based cooperative arrangements are perverted and co-opted by capitalist thought, actors, and institutional arrangements, and that they have been and are being strategically employed and exploited to bring about rapid social change, which reminds us of what happened during the dictatorship of Changi Park. So, coming to a conclusion and our final thoughts, we must recognize that climate change, ecological decline, and enduring forms of inequality and exploitation are not sustainable. That due to the processes of enclosure and externalization, the wealthy are better off because others are worse off, and that the burdens of climate change largely fall on the poor. Economic growth, whether green or not, is not the answer. In that sense, the SDGs should really reconsider this kind of global growth fantasy. And degrowth should replace economic growth. Less is more, and we should move towards a fair redistribution of economic and social activities and gains. We can take inspiration from Ubuntu and Dure. Our personhood is strongly connected to the personhood of others. Community also ties us to the past and future generations. And tackling challenges locally and helping each other is a must, while also committing ourselves to changing national and global institutional arrangements. It's important that we involve people in the future of the planet, and it also means, therefore, to strengthen democratic awareness, institutions, and practices. And we should be vigilant regarding possible co-optation and reframing of Ubuntu and Dure. We should thereby also avoid this romanticization of Ubuntu and Dure, and we should avoid this more caricatural representation of the West, because even in the West we see similar so-called traditional thought systems and practices that can be identified there. Thanks very much.